It's redraft season. You want to know which players to draft, which players you should be selecting in your redraft leagues. But most importantly, you also need to focus on which wide receivers you should be avoiding. We're here. Well, this is the Fantasy Sanctuary. We cover best ball dynasty redraft, and we're going to walk you through 7 wide receivers you should be avoiding right now in your redraft leagues. So we'll kick it off at the top. Terry McLaurin feels like he's a better NFL wide receiver than fantasy wide receiver. Year in, year out, gets hyped as a player that could break into the top 12, yet has consistently produced as a back end wide receiver 2, early wide receiver 3. There's some serious question marks about the quarterback room at the moment, Tom. Is Terry McLaurin a guy that you are just avoiding at all costs?
I mean, in best ball drafts, I'm sprinkling in some Terry McLaurin. I think there's easily ceiling outcomes for him. And I think, in the one game we saw him with Sam Howell, he had 3 catches for 74 yards and a touchdown on 6 targets. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that he does have big games. But with Terry McLaurin, it's just always a difficult click in redraft because you look back at his career, these are the quarterbacks that he's played with: Case Keenum, Dwayne Haskins, Alex Smith, Dwayne Haskins again, Kyle Allen, Taylor Heineke, Ryan Fitzpatrick, Garrett Gilbert, Carson Wentz, Taylor Heineke again, and Sam Howell. It's never been easy for Terry McLaurin, and I just don't think that it's suddenly going to start getting easy for him now with Sam Howell just intoned as the starter. I think if there was a situation where Jakobi Brissett was going to be obviously coming in at some point, then I'd be wheels up on Terry McLaurin. I think Jakobi Brissett could easily make McLaurin the most fantasy relevant he's been. But you look back last year, and with Curtis Samuel and Jahan Dotson both healthy and on the field, McLaurin's target share dropped down to a career low 21.8%. I'm high on Jahan Dotson. I think he flashed at times. I think that this offense, Eric Bieniemy is going to try and spread the ball around. He's going to keep defenses guessing, and he's going to look to get the ball out quickly a lot of the time because that offensive line isn't going to be particularly good either. So I'm a little worried that there's going to be a lot of dud weeks. And in redraft, when you set that lineup week after week, I think it's going to be very difficult knowing when to trust Terry McLaurin.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I try not to buy too much into camp hype, but the noises out of Washington at the moment are horrendous. We're hearing that Jakobi Brissett, Sam Howell are both struggling to pick up the offense. There was a report today that Eric Bieniemy's too intense of a coach and he's upsetting people. It just sounds like this could be an entire offense that we're wanting to avoid. You've mentioned there that Jahan Dotson's also, competing for targets. I wouldn't be shocked if Jahan Dotson was the one in terms of target leader by the end of this year. I think that it could well be the passing of the torch. Yes, Terry McLaurin's not old, but he's getting up there. He obviously wasn't a young prospect when he first entered the league. And I just think that for me, Terry McLaurin, I'm happy to take him if he falls past ADP, but this is a guy that I just can't see myself ever drafting him at ADP because there's so much better options in those middle rounds where it seems like there's plenty of exciting wide receivers. Another wide receiver that's got plenty of competition in the target sweepstakes, DK Metcalf. It feels like this offense could absolutely explode, but with so many mouths to feed, you got DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, outproduces ADP year in, year out. They've obviously highly drafted rookie and Jackson Smith and Jigba. Then you've got the likes of Noah Fant. Plus we've got the running backs, Kenneth Walker, Zach Charbonnet. Like, is there just too many mouths to feed for DK Metcalf to produce that wide receiver 1 season that he's been drafted to hopefully produce?
Yeah, and so let's look back at last year. He finished as the wide receiver 25 in half PPR points per game, and now he's going as the wide receiver 16. But what's changed since then to make us believe that he's going to take a step forward? It's, the team added Jackson Smith and Jigba, as you said, who is a volume hog. He's the kind of player who commanded targets at a higher rate than Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave in college. So we know the Seahawks want to play more 3 wide receiver sets. Jackson Smith and Jigba's going to be out there, whether it's to start the season or as the season goes on. DK Metcalf's never really separated from Tyler Lockett in terms of team target share. They've always been very similar in what they've had. And it's just very difficult for me to get on board with DK Metcalf really breaking into that elite tier. And the cost of drafting him where he is quite difficult. Last year, he only had 5 top 15 weekly finishes. And for a player that you're drafting sort of like on the fringes of round 3, early round 4, I kind of want a little bit more of that. I think that if JSN does start eating into the targets, and if he really becomes Gino's favorite target in those layup ones, then Tyler Lockett's still going to eat. We've seen that this offense, they do like to get the tight ends involved. And I think that DK Metcalf is going to have a monster year in terms of touchdowns to be able to pay off on this cost. And it's just not something I want to gamble on.
Yeah, it feels interesting, doesn't it? You wouldn't be shocked if any one of these three wide receivers finished as the lead wide receiver in terms of fantasy production. You wouldn't be shocked if any of these three wide receivers finished as the third wide receiver. Yet one of them is going 3 rounds ahead of the other two, and I just can't get my head around that. So I think DK Metcalf is absolutely one of those players that falls into my Calvin Johnson theory of people overdraft him because he's big, because he's fast, because he looks good and he's exciting. But actually, if you look at the numbers, there's not really much evidence that he should be going around ahead of Lockett and JSN, let alone 3 rounds. So yeah, I'm very much on board. This is a guy that I think at cost we should probably be avoiding. Moving to a very different type of player, small, shifty, maybe the best player in the league with the ball in his hands, Kadarius Toney. It feels like people just want to buy into a Patrick Mahomes wide receiver. He's the best quarterback in the league. He's maybe the best quarterback ever. There's got to be a wide receiver, surely. So we're just trying to push somebody up, and Kadarius Toney was the one this year. Do you think that there's any world that Kadarius Toney can repay the ridiculous prices that he's currently going at?
I don't, and he has dropped it. Got to point out that ever since he turned up to the start of training camp and immediately was injured, and then the talk is that he might be ready for week 1, he has slid, but only to the point where he's wide receiver 46 and wide receiver 45 is Sky Moore. So it's like people still aren't completely convinced. People aren't completely out on Kadarius Toney. He's still talking about a top 100 pick in redraft leagues and on Underdog. And the believers, they point to Kadarius Toney's insanely high targets per route run figures. But, we're talking about a player who he only ran 8 routes in the Super Bowl and Conference Championship. The fact is that Toney just carries this narrative around with him that he's not particularly good at picking up the playbook. He's not particularly a hard worker in terms of learning everything behind the scenes. And that seems to make sense for what we see on the field, as well as the only consistency that he's had for his career has been being injured. I think he's an electric player, but I think he's just going to be always one of those players where plays are designed for him, and you get those spike weeks, you get those touchdowns, and he can be a fun player to mix in for DFS, for best ball. But I don't think I'd ever be able to start Kadarius Toney in a managed league with any faith.
At some point, we need to start just looking at what the player is. This is a player that was a 4-year player at Florida. At no point did he ever consistently get on the field and produce. He had a mix of injuries, falling out with coaches, not understanding the playbook. He gets drafted in the first round because there is undeniable talent by the Giants. He gets injured. He falls out with coaches. He doesn't understand the playbook. He then gets traded to the Chiefs. And yes, when he's on the field, he has been incredible. But he's not picked up the playbook. He's wasn't on the, as you said, on the field when it mattered the most in the Conference Championship and Super Bowl. And then he's got injured again. I just don't know if I can ever buy into a player that, yes, when he's on the field, he's going to be phenomenal. But would you be shocked if he only played 1 or 2 games this year? And do you have any idea when you're going to be able to put him in that starting lineup? Because I sure as hell don't. And I don't want to waste a valuable roster spot on a guy that I'm saying I'm probably going to have to carry for 17 weeks, but I might only be able to start him for 3 because he might get injured again. It just feels like, to me, this is a player. I don't ever have a do not draft list because I believe that at some point everyone becomes a value. But Kadarius Toney is potentially the one player that might fall onto that do not draft list because I just can't see a world where I click it.
So on that, okay, if Kadarius Toney is going around pick 90 at the minute, how far would he have to fall for you to take him?
He'd have to be at least in the double-digit rounds.
I think, so the only times I've taken him lately in best ball leagues, he's fallen to around 110. And at that point, it's like, okay, in terms of ceiling, you're looking at the Juju Smith-Schuster, Alan Lazard area of the draft, and I'm completely fine taking a shot. But where you go inside the top 100, I just can't do it.
Yeah, no, I'm completely in agreement with you 100% there. Another guy that has often injured, has hardly been on the field in the last 3 years. As you can see, they played 10 games in the last 3 years. Michael Thomas, The rumors are that he's finally back healthy. This ankle injury that's taken 3 years to recover is finally healed. Do you believe that, can't guard Mike is back, or are you just not going to touch him?
No, I struggle with this one again because he's going in a similar area of the draft, wide receiver 49 to Kadarius Toney, who we talked about before. So it's kind of like right before that drop off where you're looking at Juju Smith-Schuster, Alan Lazard, and these kind of players where there's a lot of projection with them. And Michael Thomas, like you mentioned, he's played 10 games in 3 years. He's only played 3 games in the last 2 years. Last year, when he did play, he did look okay. But it's worth pointing out that in Chris Olave, it might be the best competition that Michael Thomas has ever faced for targets. You look at what else the Saints have got. Their running back room is just a slew of different names who they clearly want to run the ball. It seems like they've treated that position with a priority this offseason, making sure that be solid. And then Juwan Johnson at tight end is a player who we just saw score 7 touchdowns and really exceed expectations. Taysom Hill is always going to be a question mark. And in the quarterback, Derek Carr, we know Derek Carr likes to force the ball downfield. He likes to drive it downfield. Well, Michael Thomas has made hay off the slant routes, hasn't he? So, is this going to be an offense that doesn't really feature him? Rashid Shaheed's been flashing in training camp. Apparently, Michael Thomas is taking things very slowly because we do want him to be able to actually get back out there and be healthy when he is. But at a certain point, if you're not getting involved in the game plans in training camp, are you going to be able to hit the ground running when the season starts? I just think, as sad as it is, the best days of Michael Thomas are long behind him.
Yeah, I think you can basically copy and paste everything I've just said about Kadarius Toney and put it in here with Michael Thomas. I just can't get on board with a guy that has basically not been on the field for the last 3 years, and I'm having to draft him at a position in the draft where I'm relying on him. He's probably going to be your wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5. You need to be able to plug him in weeks, to cover bye weeks, to cover injuries, and I just don't think you can do that. Yes, there is absolutely a world where Michael Thomas is the Michael Thomas of old. He commands 150 targets. He finished the season as a back-end wide receiver 1. Like, that is within his range of outcomes. But I think that's such a small chance that I just can't take the risk, because the realistic outcome is that he probably plays 4 or 5 games. He has a mediocre year, and he just rides off onto the sunset because the Saints can finally get out from the contract after this year.
Yeah, completely agree with it.
The next guy we talked about, Derek Carr, his old team, the Las Vegas Raiders, went out and spent some money in free agency. They bought across Jakobi Meyers from New England. Felt like he was always kind of an advanced stats darling whilst he was in New England, had great yards per route run numbers, had great targets per route run numbers, but never really truly produced from a fantasy perspective. He now finds himself in a home where Devontae Adams is going to be the clear target hog. There's Hunter Renfrow floating around. They've gone and spent, early round draft capital on Michael Mayer. Is there just too many mouths to feed in a low volume passing offense for Jakobi Meyers to pay back on his investment?
Yeah, that's a big part of this. I think if Hunter Renfrow was moved on, I'd have a lot easier time drafting Jakobi Meyers. I think, if we were getting positive reports out of training camp that Jimmy G was looking really good, it might be easier. But all reports are that he's struggling with things. So, but the crux of everything for me comes back to Davante Adams. I think Davante Adams is going to be fine. I think, his fantasy output will still be solid. But for him to really be good, he's going to have to come back towards the line of scrimmage. Last year, we had Derek Carr pushing the ball downfield to him and constantly targeting him downfield. That's just not Jimmy Garoppolo's game. I mean, last year, Davante Adams had over 30 downfield targets. Jimmy G only targeted downfield at a rate of 27, like deep targets at the rate of 27 last year. In the last 3 years, he's only been over 30 deep targets in one season. So Davante Adams is clearly going to have to come back towards the line of scrimmage. We know that he can play in and out of the slot. So if that happens, then what happens with Jakobi Meyers? Does Jakobi Meyers get pushed to the perimeter? Is Jimmy Garoppolo going to be happy pushing the ball outside the numbers? There's an awful lot of ambiguity there. I think that if something happens with Hunter Renfrow, then I'll definitely be in on Jakobi Meyers. But at the minute, I just feel like there's going to be weeks where Jakobi Meyers goes out and puts up like 3 catches for 40 yards or something like that, which isn't really going to do an awful lot of good for you.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels like he's a boom bust option, but without the great boom potential. He's kind of a middle bust option, which is just not a player that you ever particularly want in fantasy, is he?
Well, yeah, and he's not been a prolific touchdown scorer throughout his career. So are we really imagining that he's going to go into Las Vegas and all of a sudden in the red zone, he's going to command the trust of Jimmy Garoppolo over Devontae Adams, over Michael Mayer, who's a big target, or even over just using Josh Jacobs, who they're going to play on the franchise tag and absolutely just might as well run him into the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. And another player that has seen, more mouths to feed in the offense, Zay Jones had a phenomenal year last year. Let's not underappreciate how good he was last year. He finished as the wide receiver 24 in PPR leagues. He had 115 targets, which is just mind-blowing to think of a player of his caliber commanding that volume of targets. But now we move into 2023. They bring in Calvin Ridley. I cannot see a world where he is even close to that sort of target volume. And therefore, I feel like he's being massively overdrafted.
Yeah, I mean, the time to draft Zay Jones was last year. And if Jags hadn't done anything this offseason, then that would have been fine. But the addition of Calvin Ridley, who is reinstated by all accounts, is looking phenomenal in training camp. It's not just a case of, okay, he's made a few plays. It's that he's fast, that he's looking really good shape. He's coming back in a way which a lot of people didn't expect him to do. And yes, there probably will be hiccups with Calvin Ridley. He hasn't really played a lot of football in the last 2 years, but he's going to eat into that downfield target stuff. Christian Kirk, he plays predominantly from the slot. He averaged 77% of his snaps there over the last 2 years. Meanwhile, Ridley, he's the deep target. He's seen the deep target on 21% of his career targets. His average depth of target has never been below 10. Christian Kirk has been around 8.8 last year. So it feels like that's going to be quite sticky. But Zay Jones, he had 7.7 targets per game, 800 receiving yards, and he ran a route on over 90% of plays. But that's where Calvin Ridley is definitely going to eat into them. It seems unfathomable that Calvin Ridley isn't going to be within a month running in the 2 wide receiver sets. And if Zay Jones isn't in them, then he's going to become very touchdown reliant. We've seen reports out of camp that Trevor Lawrence has been leaning on him in touchdown drills and stuff like that. But I don't want to bet on touchdowns. If you're just betting on touchdowns, okay, Zay Jones goes out and gets you 2 catches for 30 yards and a touchdown. You're talking, 9 points or so? That's not good enough. That's the kind of week where you can be looking at the box score of the game and thinking, oh, okay, well, Zay Jones got involved. That should be okay. And then you go to check your fantasy team and you lost to somebody whose wide receivers all put up 15 to 16 points.
It's just an unexciting option, isn't it? I'm so excited about the Jags and what they're going to be this year, and I want as many Jags players as possible. But Zay Jones is the one that there's just too many mouths to feed. I can't see a world where, you just got to do the maths. Calvin Ridley's probably going to be 25 to 30% target share. Christian Kirk's going to be 20 to 25% target share. Evan Ingram's probably going to be 15 to 20%. Trevor Etienne's going to probably be around 10 to 15%. That doesn't leave a huge slice of the pie for Zay Jones. So I just think it's just one too many mouths to feed. And I think sadly Zay Jones is going to be the guy that's on the outside looking in. One other guy that, look, we're talking about too many mouths to feed. He's basically the only mouth to feed in Arizona. Marquise Brown. Is this just a case of the Kyler injury means that you don't want to touch him?
In best ball, I have no problem with Kyler Murray. I think you can build rosters where you take Marquise Brown as like your 3rd, 4th wide receiver, and there's no problem with that. He's going as the wide receiver 32. And he is entering this year on the back of a career high in PPR points per game. He was the 21st wide receiver in that. But he saw his deep ball rate drop to a career low 20.4%. And the whole play last year was that he was going to play with his friend Kyler Murray, and Kyler Murray was a better downfield thrower than Lamar Jackson. And then it just wasn't there, and then when Kyler got injured, obviously things spiraled. But this offensive line in Arizona looks awful, easily a bottom 5 unit. We haven't heard anything about when Kyler Murray's going to play. He's still, the team are taking it easy and taking it slow with him. And by all accounts, things are going a bit weird with Colt McCoy and the rookie whose name I can't remember. But in training camp, there's always talk about how they're not even throwing balls at times, and sometimes they're just pointing towards the pass would have been. And it just seems like this is a team that expecting anything out of them this year is going to be ugly. You know, they don't have a good defense. We don't have a good offense. And there's no other weapons to draw coverage. You look over Marquise Brown's career, and typically he's played with the likes of Mark Andrews or DeAndre Hopkins, who've been able to draw coverage from defenders. Now he's going to get an awful lot of focus from teams who are able to hone in on him. In all due respect to Rondale Moore, Greg Dortch, Mike Wilson, they are not the kind of players that you're even going to need to put your cornerback 2 on. You can quite happily put your cornerback 3 on those players. So I think the only time I would be taking Marquise Brown is if he slipped a bit and you're able to stash him as like your wide receiver 5 and really just wait out the bye week situation when you need somebody to start, or when you get a look at Kyler Murray and you can see Kyler Murray back. And then perhaps it'll be time for Marquise Brown to see like a 30% target share and really capitalize on things.
Yeah, I think for me, if we're saying, right, Kyler Murray is back, then fine. I can kind of get on board with Marquise Brown because, as you said, I think he could command that 30% target share in this offense. But let's talk about the start of the season. In redraft, it is so important to get off to a good start because otherwise you're chasing your tail. This is a guy that's going to be catching passes from either a 5th-round rookie, and, you know, Clayton Tune, I wasn't a big fan of him coming out. I didn't think that he had an NFL quality arm. I'd be gobsmacked if he's good enough to win the starting job. Or you've got Colt McCoy, who's on his, I think, 5th NFL team. He's got a career ADOT of 7.7. Like, this is not a guy that is pushing the ball down the field. This is a guy that is quick reads, dump the ball off, get it out of his hand. That's not the targets that we want Marquise Brown seeing. And I just don't see a natural kind of marriage between the two. So, yeah, if you can draft Brown in a scenario where, as you said, you can wait till, you know, double-digit weeks to put him in your starting lineup, fine. But I'm not sure there's many redraft leagues where you're going to be able to have Marquise Brown as your wide receiver 4 or 5. Chances are you're probably going to have him as your wide receiver 2, 3, and rely on putting him in that flex spot week in, week out, and it's just not going to be exciting. And I fear that you're going to be chasing the 8 ball and you know, trying to play catch up as soon as you start making that selection. So yeah, not a fan of Marquise Brown and completely get that. So that's 7 wide receivers you should avoid. If you're here and you've not hit the thumbs up, you've not left a comment, you've not hit that subscribe button, you are absolutely missing out. We've got so much more content coming over the next few days, and you do not want to miss it.